Well, welcome everybody to the presentation. Tonight is the third presentation in our Central State University Extension series on integrated pest management in our small farm webinar series. So tonight we're going to be talking about deer management and continuing to use integrated pest management. My name is Denise Natoli Brooks. I'm one of the agriculture and natural resource educators with Central State University. I am based in Southern Ohio, where we certainly have white-tailed deer, and also lots of other pests, weeds, things that we try to manage in our gardens, our fields, our growing spaces. So tonight we're going to focus on deer, which are by far the biggest pest in terms of size, the individual animals, and ones that are present throughout all of Ohio. So as I'm presenting the slideshow and talking about the deer, will be a small group. I'm very comfortable with you unmuting yourself to ask a question. You can also type a question in the chat, but it is harder for me to notice the questions in the chat as we're going along. Also, the mute function is very nice. I appreciate everybody having that on during the presentation, but do feel free to unmute again if you have a question. So why did we pick deer as an animal to focus on in the integrated pest management portion of our small farm series? Because deer really like to eat a lot of the things that we like to grow. And we don't want them to eat that. We want to be able to harvest what we grow and enjoy it ourselves. So this evening, what we're going to cover is the white-tailed deer, kind of its history in Ohio, both a natural history and a cultural history. That'll be a relatively brief part of the presentation. And then we're really going to spend a lot of time on the management of white-tailed deer, the integrated pest management piece. And just a few different types of integrated pest management that we'll talk about are listed there, with exclusion or keeping the deer out to begin with, scaring them away, creating buffers that will distract them from what we're actually growing, things that deer find repelling, and then also just controlling the overall deer population. So we do have options, we do have tactics to employ to control the deer and be able to successfully grow and harvest the crops that we do want. Now, white-tailed deer actually have a very, very long history and important history in Ohio. I do think it's helpful for us to understand the animal itself as we work to control its influence on what we grow. So I've got a few key things that I wanted to share. And the first word that I have here is crepuscular, which is one of my favorite science words. All that crepuscular means is that it's an animal that's most active at dusk and dawn. So crepuscular. And in fact, I was outside right before we started our presentation, right? So we started at 7 p.m. in October. I was outside at 6:45. And wouldn't you know, I saw a deer, an adult deer, walking, thankfully not in an area where I'm trying to grow stuff, but outside of my property through a field. It's the time of day that they are most active. So crepuscular, we really want to look at keeping them from our sites at dusk and dawn, because that is the key time that they're moving around and feeding. It doesn't mean they won't feed during the night or during the day, but the dawn and dusk crepuscular time is key. Also, they like edges. So places where fields meet forests are popular places for deer, where that habitat changes. So if you have a growing space, a field, and you also have a forest or a really brushy area, that edge, that change in habitat can attract deer quite a bit. So it's something to consider where you plant things. If it's something that deer really, really like, you may not want to plant it right on the edge close to the forest or the really shrubby space that they may be spending time in. They're also herbivores. They eat plants, but lots of different types of plants. And just like us, they have favorite foods. They have foods they don't like as much, but they'll eat when there's nothing else. And they have foods that they just don't eat unless they really, really have to. But they are herbivores and they eat a lot of different things. Generally, what we are talking about with the white-tailed deer and words we use to describe them, a male is a buck, a female is a doe, and the young, the juvenile with spots, is a fawn. Those fawns are adorable, but a healthy doe can have 3 fawns at once. And in fact, it's pretty common for a healthy adult doe to have 2 fawns, to have twins regularly. So the numbers of deer can increase quite quickly when a doe can have 1 to 3 fawns in a single year. They are notable jumpers. I mean, they can easily jump 12 feet high, if not higher, up to 15 feet, quite honestly. And they are so abundant. The numbers in Ohio aren't exact, but the low end of estimates that I've looked up are 650,000, but I've seen numbers much, much higher, much, much higher. We have a lot of them. They like it here in Ohio, that's for sure. But I mentioned that they're really important culturally, and they have been in Ohio since the last ice age. So where there weren't glaciers, so the southern Ohio area that wasn't glaciated, that's where they would have showed up first, and they slowly spread throughout all of Ohio. They were used, their food, their delicious meat, but important food for many, many, many years. Their skins, those furs, that was clothing. Very important. Their bones, their antlers used as tools. So they have been important to people that have lived in what is now Ohio for a very, very long time. And you can find connections to this animal in a lot of the words that we use today. So the Ohio buckeye, which is our tree, the buckeye tree, but that buckeye is actually because the seed of the buckeye tree looks like the eye of a buck, a deer. And also, if you think of the term, how much does it cost? It costs the buck, right? That actually comes from deer, because many years ago, a buck was a buck skin when it was traded and used as money. So the deer has a lot of history in our state. And it is so important, and has been considered so important, that it is officially our state mammal. So many people might think, oh my gosh, the deer, our state mammal, it's such a pest. But it has such an important history that we do have the deer. What a lot of people don't know is that at one point, the deer were hunted to the point that there were no deer left in Ohio, right? Can you imagine that? So around 1900, there were no deer in Ohio. None. They had been hunted so heavily. But efforts were made to reintroduce deer, and then they naturally moved in from surrounding states. And by the 50s or so, there were deer in all of Ohio's counties again. And the numbers have grown since then. But they are really, really plentiful now. And where that's a concern, in addition to damaging crops, it's a concern because they can carry diseases, and some that are really concerning or are diseases that ticks carry. And that is another reason that we want to think about controlling our proximity to the deer as well. So not just because they're destroying crops, but also because they can be carriers of the ticks, that then the ticks are spreading diseases to humans, to our pets, to our animals, our livestock. So a second kind of concern with the deer. What I do want to highlight, though, is that they are nonetheless part of our natural system in Ohio. Even if they're not part of our farm, they are part of our natural system. So I am going to pause for a sec and let people into the meeting that I saw were in the lobby. There we go. And then continue on. So we've got a deer, we can love them, we can hate them, we can be somewhere in between. But regardless, if we're trying to grow crops, what we really want to think about is how do we manage them? How do we live with them? And there is a path to do that. The path is different for everybody in your situation, but there is a path. And that's something that I want to highlight. So with integrated pest management, and the kind of pyramid, the triangle that you see, we don't want to go to crazy means right away to control the deer population. We want to really think about, what can I handle? What do I accept with the deer being present? So that's your threshold that you're establishing. At what point do I consider the deer to be enough of a problem to take some sort of action? Then we want to make sure we're keeping an eye on the deer, monitoring them, and looking for damage that they might be causing in our fields, on our crops, on our property. And I identify that, document it, so that when you get to a point where you've reached that threshold and you have to take action, you've been managing and monitoring all of that, and that you do things that are thinking ahead to prevent the damage as well, to deter the deer from the property, from the crops. And then maybe if things get really bad, you'll have to take more serious actions. But quite honestly, a ton of this integrated pest management idea is thinking ahead. So you're preventing any damage from your pest, from the deer in this case, from happening in the first place. So it essentially is about making a plan so you know what to do. So instead of just reacting to damage, you're actually thinking ahead. It can be really, really helpful. So what I would like to do is go through a few different things that are part of your integrated pest management plan for deer, and options for ways to prevent the deer from getting into the crops in the first place. One of the biggest things that you can do and think through is, how do I keep those deer out? How do I exclude them? What kind of barriers can I put up to make my space harder for the deer to get into? And by harder to get into, consider harder to get into than the next field or the property down the road, right? The deer, they're like us. They're going to go to the easiest space to get their food, the most convenient space to get their food. So if your wonderful vegetable growing space is very available, they're going to have a nice meal. But if you have some sort of barrier, some kind of fencing, they're going to keep going and find somebody else's space to eat their veggies, or find other plants in the environment to eat that they would normally eat anyway. The deer only becomes an actual pest to us when it jumps the fence. It gets past the barrier and then starts eating the crops that we're trying to protect. So think about how deer can get in right now in your space. Do you have barriers and fences? What are the entry points that are kind of weaker? Where are there gates? Are the gates regularly closed? Sometimes we can have great fences, but if the gate's left open, then what's the point of the fence? It's an easy way for a pest like a deer to get in. And then what other activities are happening in the area that are luring the deer, encouraging them to hang out? So, feeding wildlife always would attract the wildlife, obviously, but even things like feed for pets, for livestock, is that accessible to deer too? Something to consider. Can you make it not accessible? And then any other temptation, and even stuff like water sources. And this is sometimes with livestock and pets as well, that we have water for them outside. Can you bring it in? Can you put it in a space that the deer can't get to it? And then in our specialty crops, there's a lot of composting that happens. So we have food that we've grown that we can't actually eat, and it goes into the compost. Really important to bury those items as opposed to leaving the edible scraps on the top of the compost pile, because then that's just asking for wildlife, not just deer, to get in there as a pest. but really think about, how do I exclude, how do I create barriers to make that deer not want to come to my property? We're going to look at a few fencing options. Deer are great jumpers, like I said, but even a fence, any kind of fence, they have to do some work to jump over it. So any kind of fence can help a bit, but certain fences can be a bit more effective. And we're going to look at a few things that can help to deter the deer. So in this situation, we're actually looking at electric net fencing, which is often used with livestock, poultry. It can be used with smaller ruminants as well, like goats. The net fencing is an interesting option because it's quick. It has built-in posts, and the fencing is the white fencing that you can see in the background behind the chickens in this picture. You can move it. You can put it up, you can take it down pretty easily. It does have an electric charge if you connect it to a fencer, an energizer, that can be a deterrent for different pests, not just deer, and not just for keeping the animals you want inside, but it also is a nice visual barrier too. This fence can come in different heights. This one is a 4-foot high fence in the picture. Could a deer jump it? Definitely. If they could get to other tasty food without jumping this fence, would they? Yes. This one does work to go around a garden. And in terms of being really frugal in your fencing options, if you find somebody that has electric net fence that no longer functions to carry electricity through it, and they're no longer using it to protect livestock, you might ask them about using it to put around a market garden, because it can be a really nice, easy option, and you're reusing a product whose its initial use isn't really being used anymore. But if you put in an electric net fence around a veggie garden, you're protecting from lots of different pests. A starter kit can be anywhere from $530 to $730, depending on what kind of setup you're interested in, and that would include the fence or the energizer to carry electricity through it. This situation is a double fence situation in the picture. Behind the electric net fence that can be moved and put wherever it's needed, there's also a perimeter fence, just using a T-post and a metal fence too. That double fence is a secondary deterrent for deer, because they would have to hop over 2 fences to get to whatever tasty food, whatever plants they see inside that they're trying to get to. Now, the fencing options there, that double fence, just think of it as making more work for the deer themselves. In the next example, there's also some simple tools used, everyday tools, not necessarily set up to be like a permanent fence, but sometimes we only need to put a fence up around our specialty crops during the growing season. That's when we're concerned about protecting them. So in this situation, the white posts are plastic step-in posts. Those come in plastic and they come in fiberglass too. And then the fencing is, again, just a metal fence, this size of holes, and it would make it a goat fence by name. But a step-in post, the plastic step-in posts, they're not the most durable. So they're out in the sun, they may not last you more than a couple years, but a 4-foot post is about $250, $260. The fiberglass posts are thinner. They are a little less too. They're a little bit more than $2 a piece. And then the goat fence itself, as you get it in a roll, different lengths, but a goat fence that is also about 4 feet high is, let's see, a 330-foot long roll is about $450. And that fence will last a long time. It can be cut to size for whatever you need, and it actually has a lot more uses than just this. In this case, it is protecting a strawberry patch. And deer and a lot of other pests do enjoy eating strawberries. So this is protecting a strawberry patch. If you were to use some sort of metal T-post in any of these situations, which that's an option too, they're much more durable. They last a lot longer. They're also more expensive. So a 5-foot metal T-post is a little bit over $5 a piece. So as you think about investing in fencing, which I do think it's smart to invest in fencing, you might be investing in pieces and parts over time, and then pricing it out is helpful. Now, the metal fence in this picture that's protecting the strawberries, what I call a goat fence. A second purpose is to protect your woody plants. So you have shrubs, you have trees, maybe you're growing berries, currants, potentially small fruit trees, young fruit trees, right? Deer really like a lot of that stuff. And you have to create some sort of protection around those woody plants. One, so the deer don't rub up against it, especially bucks. And bucks tend to rub against woody plants when they have velvet on their antlers and they're kind of rubbing the velvet off. It's itchy. So they rub on things. So you get these rubs on trees that hunters look for. But we don't want them on our trees that we're growing for apples and pears and plums and wonderful things like that. So sometimes a tree tube, a metal fence is what you need to protect those individual trees if it doesn't make sense to do a fence around a whole orchard, or perhaps you have a fence around a whole orchard as step one and you have some sort of tree tube and tree protection around trees as step two. So in this case, it's the metal goat fence, the same one that was protecting strawberries, protecting young trees as well. So you can use the goat fence, which I mentioned. You can use chicken wire for this too. Chicken wire is just a little easier to bend. So that's nice when you're creating these tree tubes, but it's not as durable when something's rubbing against it. And then the actual term tree tube, that's something you can purchase to protect young trees as well. So if we looked at that in terms of how much it costs to make these investments, chicken wire that's about 3 feet tall, you would buy in a roll, and you can buy it in different size mesh. So if we look at cost, the smaller the hole in that mesh, the more the chicken wire will cost, because that's just more metal. So 1-inch mesh on chicken wire is about $85 for 150 feet of it versus $80 for a 2-inch mesh. So there's a little bit of a price difference there. Tree tubes are great. They're durable. They last for a number of years, but they're kind of a specialty item and they can be expensive to make that investment. So a 3-foot tree tube, like for one tree tube for one tree, is $275. And then you purchase a stake, it could be a bamboo stake or a wood stake, to attach it to the ground and zip tie things together. So if you have a lot of trees, that could end up being an expensive but effective option. If you're just planting those trees, those fruit trees and shrubs, sometimes you spend more money on the tree tubes than you do the individual seedlings. So that sometimes can be tough to swallow, but in the long term, it might really help you with survival of those items, because the deer not only rub on these trees and they not only eat fruit on mature trees, they'll eat the tops of the young plants as well. They can even kill some of the trees or just cause them to need to resprout, and they just then never get to the size you need them to, or they get too weak to really be productive plants for you. So this is more for protecting the woody plants that we might have in our collection. Now, as we get into some of the spaces that we're growing and we're really concerned about deer, like there's a lot of deer, maybe it's a very urban space, lots of green grass around, lots of deer, there's no hunting allowed to control that population, and you just know if you plant a lovely market garden that you're pretty much going to feed the deer instead of get to harvest anything. Well, that's when you might really look at stepping it up and doing something pretty strong, like a chain link fence. So in this situation, we've got what looks like some really nice beans growing on an upright trellis with T-posts, and then behind it you can see a black chain link fence. Nice, strong, that's probably a 10-foot chain link fence. And that is at a community garden where there is a lot of deer pressure. It's also adjacent to a river, which is a corridor for wildlife. So the deer are using that to move around as well. So this is a space that had to make a serious investment in deer fencing. And not just deer fencing, but pretty serious chain link fence. So when I looked at some prices for chain link, as expected, it's going to be a bigger investment. 50 feet of a 6-foot chain link fence is about $810. And 50 feet of a chain link, like the one in the picture, the 10-foot, is about $810. So it adds up, but it is a long-term investment. It'll last a long time. There are a lot of different options out there, but this one is for sure a long-term investment and probably the longest term investment that I'll mention this evening. I mentioned previously that you can do double fencing. This is an example of using that 10-foot chain link, which is in the background. And we're looking at the corner of a chain link fence. You can see the supports in the corner, they're black. And then within the growing space, there's a decorative fence. That decorative fence on its own isn't going to stop a deer. They could jump over that, and that one's about 3 feet tall. But the deer has to get through the outer perimeter and then has to get through that secondary perimeter, and they're pretty close together. So likely if a deer gets into this site, gets over that 10-foot chain link, they're going to find something to eat where they don't have to hop over another fence, even if it's just 3 feet tall. So alone, the decorative fence probably won't do too much, but in partnership with a bigger fence, it's like just a double whammy for a deer, so they don't have to work so hard to get to the food. And that's what we want to think about. Outsmart them. We don't want them to have to work. We want to make them work hard so that they give up before they get to what we're growing and they go find something else to eat. You might tell by the background, this is also another urban space where the deer pressure is very, very high. So that investment in that deer fence was critical to the success of this site being able to grow a lot of food. Consider what your current deer population is when you're thinking through integrated pest management and a plan for your site. So not only how much can you handle of the deer pressure, but what is the population of deer right now at your site? And if no hunting is allowed, assume that the population of deer will increase over time. Now, another urban site that is more limited resource, not able to make a investment in chicken wire, or not chicken wire. If they did make an investment in chicken wire, they couldn't make an investment in chain link fence. That was just too much. So in this site where deer are certainly present, chicken wire was used. So this is a setup, a do-it-yourself fence using 5-foot tall chicken wire. 6-foot T-posts were purchased. So you can see the green T-posts with white tops. There's one in the center of the picture. And then along the right-hand side of the picture, you can see an open gate. So that's an actual chain link gate purchased. This is not the most durable fence, but it's still a fence that deer have to get over if they want to eat what's inside. There's nothing growing on that side right now, but I can tell you today that site has a lot of things growing in it, even in mid-October, that deer would really enjoy eating. So this is a deterrent. The deer are more likely to eat the tall grasses outside of that fenced-in area. They're more likely to wander down by the apartments you can see in the picture and eat the landscaping around the apartments because there's no fence around it. So even something like this do-it-yourself can be effective. So of this setup, the investment, the bigger investment is buying that gate, because that is a chain link pre-made gate. And chain link gates, like just for a person to come through, you wheelbarrow can go through it, no problem. They're between $135 and $185. The chicken wire, a roll of it is reasonable, and the T-posts, again, you're buying them and they last for a long time. One thing, if you do use chicken wire, because it is a flimsier material, you do need more fence posts, those T-posts closer together to support the chicken wire, or some sort of single strand metal that goes around the whole fenced area towards the top of the chicken wire, and then probably also through the center, the midpoint of that chicken wire, just to give it a little more rigidity to stand up, because chicken wire on its own is pretty flimsy. But this is a great low cost do-it-yourself option to protect crops. But it's not foolproof, because this specific site experienced some deer damage this year. It is unknown if that deer damage happened because the gate was left open, but in a pinch, really creative way to build up a fence without buying new fence that I thought was worth sharing. And this is, again, with limited resources, and sometimes you use what's available to you, and you got to be creative. So this is the same site later in the growing season. Look at all the stuff growing in there now. There's some nice looking kale, tomatoes, a lot of stuff to protect from the deer. Bamboo posts, tall ones, 7-foot tall bamboo posts that were going to be used to create a trellis. Were actually connected to every T-post around this site. Tied on. It could have been tied on with zip ties. It could have been tied on with baling twine, whatever. It raised that 5-foot fence 2 more feet. It raised it up to 7 feet tall. And then all that's strung between the T-posts are baling twine. It was available. So you can see 2 lines going across from those bamboo stakes. That's just baling twine that's tied to each one of those posts, and it goes all the way around that site. Very simply, in one, evening, a couple hours, that 5-foot fence became a 7-foot fence, and there's been no additional deer damage at that site since that happened. I think that's a pretty cool improvement. Do it yourself. Now, if you actually buy deer fence, which that product exists, that starts at a height of 7 feet, which is what this project created, but a 7-foot deer fence usually has about a 3/4 inch mesh. It's a plastic or a poly kind of fabric. It's not a rigid fence. It's flexible. But that mesh, if you do 100-foot length of it, this is 7 feet tall. It is anywhere between $60-something to nearly $200, depending on the product, the brand, the heaviness of that mesh. Also, you can get these deer fence up to 15 feet high. So if you have some really high jumping deer and they're determined to eat your stuff, you can get a 15-foot high fence. If you get that, you can get it as long as 350 feet long. That product's available too. Once you start putting in bigger T-posts, taller T-posts to support these taller fences, the T-posts, the metal T-posts, start to get much more expensive as well. So in looking at different sites, just to pull kind of current prices, and this is not necessarily sticking with one brand and one store or anything, but what's out there, I found a 6-foot T-post price today at $13.60, which I thought seemed really high, but right now some of the metal prices are higher. There's limited supply of things, so I suppose prices are a little inflated on a lot of things right now. But again, any of the stuff will be an investment. But this is taking a 5-foot T-post, adding a 7-foot bamboo post, chicken wire, baling twine, and a little bit of single strand to create a pretty simple, low-cost, do-it-yourself deer fence. It's also now the highest fence at this site. There's other gardens at the site. So if this garden has a 7-foot high fence and the 2 other growing spaces have a 5-foot high fence, and I'm a deer, which fence am I going to choose to jump? the shorter one. So you kind of, make your site as hard as possible for the deer to get to, and they're going to choose somebody else's site to eat those crops or find unfenced areas to eat as well. Now, if no matter what you do, the deer, you just can't get ahead of them, you can't figure out how to outwit them, there is always the option of an enclosed growing situation. You've got, nice hoop houses, and they have secure doors. The key is to make sure they're closed when you're not using them. You've got row covers that go over the crops that hide them. The deer can't get to them. You can always cover your crops, and it doesn't have to be with a permanent structure either. The hoop houses can range from $10,000 to $20,000 depending on how much you put into them and how much prep work has to happen. Caterpillar tunnels, which is a simpler design, can be about $5,000, a smaller investment, but even just row covers and hoops that go over your crops, something that you might use to extend the season this time of year or protect from insects. If you get hoops, they usually come in a package, 100 count of hoops. They're metal hoops, easily bendable, 76 inches, so relatively big ones for the taller crops. So like if you're covering kale or even Brussels sprouts or something like that this time of year, 76-inch hoops, 100 count, $135. That's reasonable. You get 100 of the hoops. And the general frost protection row cover. So it's this time of year we're getting frost. Keep the stuff growing a little longer. So if you get a 10-foot by 50-foot row cover, so we're talking about covering a bed at a time, $23. It's a reasonable investment, and you can use these to protect from deer as well. It's not just to protect from insects or from frost, because you're creating a visual barrier and a physical barrier to the deer that are trying to eat the crops you're growing. So all of these are the fences and barriers. There are more options out there because we can be as creative as we want to be in creating the fences and the barriers to deter deer from getting into our growing spaces. But I'm going to move on to a different category that is a little bit different in how it's applied. And in my opinion, in the long term, it's more work. So the fences, you make that initial investment in buying the supplies and building the fence, but it's pretty much there, right? If you opt for scare tactics, you're literally just trying to scare the deer away. And there's lots of devices to do this, but the deer figure out relatively quickly that that scary jack-o'-lantern is not actually going to hurt them. And then you have a new scare tactic that you have to introduce. So, I mean, we've used scarecrows for ages, right, to scare away pests. Well, the animals get used to those pests, right, or get used to the pests get used to our scare tactics, and we're just constantly trying to create new ones. I find that to be a lot of work, but it's certainly something that can be used, especially if you've got a situation where possibly you've got some young deer and they're trying to find their space, their habitat, and they decide it's your space too. Well, maybe you need some extra scare tactics for a bit to encourage them to move on and go find another place to call their own. Scare tactics include things like balloons, like little blow up things that blow in the wind. It could be something that reflects light. It definitely can be a scarecrow, like I mentioned. Noises, some are pretty severe. There's actually noise cannons that are out there, but just things that make noises that might scare away the animals. And even things like fake coyotes, predators, things, fake dogs that are out there might scare away. In fact, real dogs, if you have pets, dogs can be great at deterring deer too. But scare tactics, the key with them is that you just have to be ready to change that tactic every few days at times, because the deer will figure it out that whatever it is isn't actually scary anymore. Another option is creating these buffers that make the deer want to eat the buffers that you plant instead of eating the food that you grow. So there's nothing worse than coming out to your space and you're like ready to harvest tomatoes early in the season, well, anytime, and you realize, oh my gosh, the deer got in and look at all these tomatoes that they've just taken a bite out of and then moved on, right? Like the picture in the center of the slide. But what could be done so the deer never get to those tomatoes if they fill their bellies with something else? Well, those are the buffers. If you plant things that they like outside of your growing space, around your growing space, it may draw them to those buffer plantings. And deer actually like beans quite a bit. So soybeans, snap beans, things like that, dry beans. If you plant some of those items, you may create this buffer that brings the deer to the buffer plants. And then there are ones, they might skip the plants that you're actually trying to harvest. Now, there are plants that deer also like seldom or rarely damage. They're just not interested in them. So an alternative buffer strip option is to plant the things that deer seldom or rarely damage around the outside of your growing space. And then that's kind of a barrier because they might come in from any direction and be like, ooh, I don't like that plant. Like they don't like sassafras. So I'm just going to stop there, turn around, go the other way. And they may never pass that buffer to see that on the other side, there's some tasty stuff. So the two ways to look at buffer strips, but it is a option for sure. Another option is just to make the space smell yucky or taste yucky. Those are repellents. And there are actual products you can buy that are sprinkled on or sprayed on around the growing space and sometimes even right on the plants. There's also things that you can hang around the growing space too. You kind of have to experiment a little bit to see what the deer are actually repelled by. Some people have a lot of luck with really fragrant soap. That it's just this strong smell, not like a food smell, but a strong smell that kind of is off-putting to them. They definitely don't like hot pepper. They don't like garlic, onions, those types of things. So whether you're planting them or you're using those smells or sprinkling that powder around, that could be a deterrent. But they work best when you don't have a lot of deer, like there's not a lot of pressure from deer. So they're often better to be used before deer get bad to just kind of keep them away. But if you already have a problem, they probably won't help. You do have to reapply because stuff washes off with the rain or blows off or just doesn't smell as strong or taste as strong over time when it's out in the sun. There's some interesting products that are out on the market, and ODNR, our Ohio Department of Natural Resources, actually has a deer damage control list of products that are repellents. A lot of them have garlic in them, hot pepper in them, or capsaicin, which is the pepper, one of the things within pepper, the hot pepper stuff. If you're growing organically or following organic practices, check OMRI, that's the Organic Materials Review Institute, to see if it's approved in organic systems. So an example of a repellent that is OMRI approved is something called Plant Skid. And when you look at what's actually in it, the first ingredient is dried blood. But it's a dry product, dried blood, vegetable oil, and water. That you mix up and you can use. So it's also interesting to look at what is in the products and is it something that I might be able to procure differently and see if that helps. Really, you can try whatever. Just make sure if you use a product, read the label. If it's not supposed to be put directly on the plants, follow those directions. There's certainly products out there that you can put them on landscape plants, but you can't put them on plants that we're going to be eating. So read the label if you're buying any products for deer control. Now, if all this stuff doesn't work, when we're looking at controlling the number of deer in an area and it's a rural space, population control through hunting is a real important tool. Hunting is not just for sport, it is a population control tool. So if you have hunting happening on your property, what kind of hunting is it? Are there certain numbers of deer that you would like to be harvested through a hunt? And by that, not just bucks, but taking does as well. What would be a good deer management plan if hunting is allowed on your property? And if hunting isn't happening, or maybe you're not hunting, how can you develop a relationship with someone who hunts responsibly to help control the population of deer through hunting? Other things that have been used, sterilization plans have been tried. It's controversial, it's expensive, and it hasn't really been shown to be truly helpful in controlling deer populations. And then in Ohio, we have hunting season specifically for deer. But if you experience damage from deer on your property, there is a deer damage control program that you work with your county wildlife officer on. And that may mean that they have to confirm that you have deer damage. And then they might issue a permit that says you can harvest more deer during hunting season than you normally would be allowed to, or even sometimes you may be able to cull deer outside of the hunting season. So it's a really important tool, and having that relationship with your wildlife officer will help you understand what's available to you where you live. Now, in a urban area and even a suburban area, this is a lot trickier because you can't hunt. In places where deer have gotten really, really bad, like just high numbers, there's been a lot of car crashes, people running into deer, people getting hurt, all of that. Some communities have actually hired sharpshooters to control deer populations. It's a really extreme measure, but that has happened in Ohio as well. No matter where you are, though, in Ohio, you will have deer. You will. But the question is, how can you plan for that? How can you make sure that your space is less attractive to deer than the spaces around you, right? If there's a space you really want to protect, how will you protect it? That's where you probably are going to use all of these methods, a combination of methods, and you might even change those methods and those tactics over time. And that's all part of not just developing your IPM, your integrated pest management plan, but also about updating that plan and recording what's worked, what hasn't worked, so that you can get as good as possible as managing and living with the deer that are around the space that you are trying to cultivate and grow crops. It's not necessarily an instant quick thing, but you will find trends over time, and you will figure out what works and what doesn't work too. So don't be afraid to try something, and don't be afraid to talk about what works and the crazy thing you tried with your, a grower that share those things, because someone might come up with something that works really well that seems off the wall. Because some of the repellents especially are kind of funny, but if it works, great, right? So sharing that. And of course, all the information I just shared with you, I didn't just share that off the top of my head. I looked at resources as well. So I did want to make sure that I highlighted that Cornell Extension has a nice minimizing deer damage in veggie crops resource. And then our own Ohio Department of Natural Resources, ODNR, has some nice deer resources through their Division of Wildlife, especially with how to contact your wildlife officer, help with deer damage, and even that deer damage control resource has a huge list of plants that lists kind of like these plants deer really, really like to eat, these plants deer rarely eat. It might help you with some of the plantings you could put in around your growing space to help deter deer as well. So there's really nice resources out there. Of course, I'm a resource too, and the agriculture and natural resources educators throughout the state are resources as well with deer, with any integrated pest management work that you are putting together, planning, thinking about, especially this time of year, as we're kind of wrapping up the growing season for a lot of us, taking time to reflect on what we did this past year, what our struggles were, what our successes were, and how we can plan for and do better next year. So do always remember that we're here to assist you. Want to make sure to take a moment to highlight our non-discrimination statement there from Central State, and then encourage you to stay connected. I do hope that we'll have some information out soon on additional webinars, topics of interest, and I'm always curious to get feedback from you to find out what topics you're interested in that we can develop webinars and presentations about. But hopefully you found this interesting, informative, and I also hope that with a little planning, we can all successfully raise our fruits and veggies while enjoying deer, but enjoying them at a distance, because that's going to help us with our success too. So I'd like to open it up to any questions.